Beneath its majestic towers, Alnwick hides a past far darker and stranger than its postcard-perfect facade suggests. This was a fortress shaken by betrayal, religious unrest, vanished wealth, secret chambers, and a ruin so wild that trees grew through its broken walls. And yet, against all logic, it rose again, reinventing itself century after century. Stay until the end, because the castle's final transformation is the one no one expects. Alnwick rises from the Northumbrian landscape with the self-assurance of a place that has always known its purpose. Long before a traveler reaches its walls, the silhouette begins its quiet work, a crown of towers layered against the sky, each one angled slightly differently, as if the entire structure were turning its head to acknowledge every direction at once. The first impression never feels accidental. The castle appears not simply built on the land, but fused with it, absorbing the rolling hills and windswept fields into its own identity, until stone and earth become indistinguishable. The closer one gets, the more the scale asserts itself. The ramparts stretch outward like a massive stone coastline, their pale surfaces catching the northern light in a way that makes the walls seem both ancient and enduring. Turrets rise in spirals that seem to test the limits of medieval engineering, reaching upward with the ambition of monuments meant to outlast their creators. Nothing about Alnwick suggests modesty. It stands as though it has been waiting for centuries to be rediscovered, to be recognized again for what it is, a guardian of the borderlands and a witness to the battles, ambitions, and dreams of generations. The placement of the castle feels almost theatrical, as if chosen by someone with a keen sense for drama and perspective. Positioned on a natural rise, Alnwick commands the surrounding plains with effortless dominance, the way a seasoned general might oversee the movements of an army. From a distance, its lines blur with the horizon, yet the closer the observer comes, the more the details emerge. Arrow slits peering like watchful eyes, heavy battlements carved with a precision that survives storms, invasions, and centuries of neglect. Every surface seems built to remind visitors that this place was never meant to be ordinary. Even the grass around the outer walls appears shaped by the castle's presence, bending subtly with the wind that flows along the stronghold's edges. The landscape accepts Alnwick as an elder, one who has outlived countless seasons and witnessed events carved into the memory of England itself. Yet what truly sets the castle apart is the way it manages to blend intimidation with allure. Most fortresses project a sense of distance or cold utility, but Alnwick balances its martial posture with a strange kind of warmth, as if the structure retains echoes of the people who built it and the countless lives once enclosed within its walls. Its towers lean in slightly at the top, creating the illusion of a welcoming gesture despite their defensive nature. Light slips between the narrow windows and spills across the stone, softening the castle's stern geometry into something almost poetic. On misty mornings, when the hills are wrapped in a pale silver haze, Alnwick appears to hover between worlds, part fortress, part legend, a place shaped as much by imagination as by architecture. And because of this dual nature, the moment one steps into its shadow, it becomes clear why Alnwick has inspired storytellers, historians, and travelers for nearly 1,000 years. It is not simply large, it is expressive. It does not merely defend, it communicates. The castle's architecture behaves like a living chronicle, each tower and wall speaking in the silent language of centuries, hinting at ancient power struggles, long-forgotten celebrations, and generations who saw these stones as the center of their world. To approach Alnwick is to approach history in its most physical form, a place where the past does not feel distant or abstract, but immediate, towering, and impossible to ignore. This is why the fortress instantly registers not just as a historic site, but as a legend made real. Its presence overwhelms in the best possible way, drawing attention and holding it with a magnetic force that feels intentional. Alnwick was built to endure, but it was also built to impress. And even now, centuries after its earliest walls were raised, it succeeds without effort. The castle stands as a testament to those who shaped it and those who preserved it. An immense stone giant whose silhouette continues to command the northern horizon, inviting anyone who sees it to step closer and discover the stories buried within its towering frame. The story of Alnwick's beginnings unfolds not in stone, but in timber, on a landscape that was far less peaceful than the rolling green fields suggest today. When the first Norman settlers surveyed this stretch of Northumberland, they were not searching for beauty or symmetry, they were searching for control. The region, positioned dangerously close to the Scottish border, was a corridor of tension where raids, shifting alliances, and territorial claims defined everyday life. This was not a place for gentle estates or quiet manners. It demanded a stronghold capable of asserting authority the moment it appeared on the horizon. And so, the earliest builders chose a rise overlooking the River Aln, a vantage point that allowed them to monitor movement across the frontier and respond quickly if danger surged from the north. The first version of Alnwick was a motte and bailey, a design that may appear simple by modern standards, but in its time represented the height of strategic efficiency. The motte was a steep artificial mound, packed earth sculpted into a defensive pedestal, crowned with a wooden tower that served as both command post and last refuge during attack. Surrounding the base was the bailey, a large enclosed courtyard fortified by stout wooden palisades. Inside this enclosure stood essential structures: barracks for soldiers, storage huts for provisions, stables, and workshops that kept the settlement functioning even under constant strain. Everything was arranged with a single guiding principle: survival. These early inhabitants were not leisurely aristocrats. They were guardians of a contested frontier, living with the constant knowledge that danger could emerge at any moment from across the border. The decision to construct the stronghold here was not based solely on the defensive advantages of the land, though those were considerable. The river provided both a natural barrier and a source of life. The surrounding terrain offered clear sightlines in every direction, allowing scouts to spot approaching forces long before they reached the settlement. And most importantly, the castle's position created a message that needed no translation. This land is claimed, patrolled, and defended. In an era when authority was measured by the presence of strong walls and loyal fighters, the motte and bailey at Alnwick became a physical declaration of Norman influence. It reminded anyone passing through, ally or rival, that this territory belonged to a people who intended to stay. While the wooden structures have long since vanished, their design can still be imagined through the contours of the land and the legacy they left behind. The moat, though eroded by time, once stood tall enough to dominate the surrounding valley. From its summit, the Norman lords could track smoke rising from distant farms, gauge the movement of travelers, and signal their own soldiers with flags or torches. The wooden tower atop the mound was compact yet formidable, built from thick beams that creaked during high winds and echoed with footsteps whenever alarms sounded. It was a place of constant vigilance, a lookout that never truly slept. Below, the bailey formed the bustling heart of early Alnwick. The sounds that filled this space, hammer strikes from the blacksmith's forge, horses stamping in their stalls, guards changing shifts along the palisade, created a rhythm of life driven by duty rather than luxury. At night, torches flickered along the perimeter, casting jittery shadows on the wooden walls and reminding everyone inside why the settlement existed. This was not simply a home, it was a warning line drawn across the northern frontier. Because of its location, Alnwick's first fortification acted as both protector and provocation. It shielded Norman interests while simultaneously challenging rival forces to test its strength. That tension shaped every decision made by the early builders, from the steepness of the moat to the thickness of the palisade and the placement of the gate. The entire complex was designed to buy time during an attack, allowing defenders to retreat to the tower while reinforcements rallied. Even in its earliest, most modest form, Alnwick held the essence of a place meant to endure conflict. And although nothing of that wooden stronghold survives today, the vision behind it set the foundation for everything the castle would eventually become. The choice of land, the understanding of defensive geometry, the awareness of the region's dangerous significance, all of these early decisions transformed a rough frontier outpost into the future site of one of Britain's greatest fortresses. The motte and bailey was only the first chapter, but it established a pattern. Alnwick would always be built with intention, shaped by conflict, and positioned as a guardian over a land that demanded strength. With time, the wooden fortifications that once defined Alnwick began to show their limits. Timber, no matter how carefully cured or cleverly reinforced, could only endure so much in a region where conflict was less an event and more a rhythm of life. The harsh northern weather gnawed at wooden palisades, rain softened the earth of the motte, and the danger of fire, whether sparked by accident or by the torches of raiders, was an ever-present threat. The de Vesey family, who inherited responsibility for the stronghold, understood that if Alnwick was to survive the realities of borderland politics, it needed to evolve beyond its temporary skin of wood. The shift towards stone was not a stylistic upgrade, but a necessity born from pressure, ambition, and a clear understanding of the turbulent world around them. Replacing timber with stone required more than hauling blocks and stacking them into walls. The builders had to rethink the very shape of the fortress, reshaping the motte and transforming the bailey into a more permanent stronghold. The first stone curtain walls rose in thick, heavy rings around the original defenses, forming a barrier designed to absorb the force of siege engines and withstand long standoffs. These early walls were simple by later standards, yet they carried a sense of determination, each block laid with the understanding that the future of the region depended on these fortifications holding firm. Where wooden towers once swayed in the wind, new stone towers emerged, squat, sturdy, and unyielding, built not for elegance, but for survival. The de Vesey builders were meticulous in their approach. They expanded the perimeter, shaping a defensive arrangement that took advantage of the natural rise of the land. New towers were placed at intervals that allowed archers to cover blind spots and defend every approach. Arrow slits were carved into the stone with geometric precision, creating narrow angles that offered long lines of sight while shielding defenders from incoming fire. Gateways, once simple openings in a palisade, became controlled choke points reinforced with portcullises and heavy wooden doors banded with iron. Every addition spoke to a mind engaged in the constant anticipation, imagining an advancing force, tracing its potential movements, and building against them. The towers themselves began to take on new forms as the castle shifted from necessity to strategy. Round and D-shaped towers emerged in place of older rectangular ones, a deliberate choice that helped deflect missiles and reduce the number of weak corners that attackers could exploit. These rounded forms also provided broader interior space, allowing for better storage, more comfortable garrisons, and improved internal mobility during a siege. The stronghold was no longer just a lookout. It was a self-contained machine built for endurance. Walls thickened into massive barriers capable of absorbing the pounding of trebuchets, while parapets evolved to accommodate more advanced defense tactics, giving archers and crossbowmen the height and angles they needed to dominate the battlefield below. This transformation cemented Alnwick's role as one of the most important defensive positions in northern England. The castle sat like a hinge between two worlds, English authority and Scottish ambition, and every improvement made by the de Vesey family strengthened that hinge. It was no longer merely a regional outpost. It had become a symbol of control and commitment, a message carved into stone that announced the Normans' determination to hold their ground. In an age when armies moved through borderlands with relentless frequency, the strength of a fortress could shift the balance of power, and Alnwick was evolving into a fortress capable of influencing that balance. As the new stone structure took shape, the castle's presence in the landscape changed drastically. What had once been a cluster of wooden defenses now stood as a solid, unmistakably permanent bastion. Travelers passing through the region saw not a makeshift settlement, but a guardian embedded in the land, an immovable sentinel observing the plains. Its rising walls cast long shadows across the hillside, and its towers stood like raised shields against the horizon. The transformation from wood to stone did more than protect the people inside. It reshaped the identity of the entire region, anchoring it to a structure that refused to yield. In this period of architectural evolution, Alnwick crystallized its reputation as a critical shield for the north. Each stone laid by the de Vesey family strengthened the castle's ability to resist assault, project authority, and embody the resilience required to survive in a world of constant instability. What began as a vulnerable wooden outpost was now solidifying into a bastion whose influence would echo through the centuries, preparing the foundations upon which future generations would build their own visions of strength and permanence. The moment Alnwick's walls rose high enough to cast a long shadow across the borderlands, they also cast a challenge. Strength invites contest, and in the uneasy stretch between England and Scotland, conflict was never a distant threat. It was a constant presence pressing against the horizon. As soon as the castle's stone defenses began to solidify, they were tested by the first true storms of war. The frontier was a living battlefield, where allegiances shifted like weather patterns, and the Scots, determined to reclaim influence in the north, saw Alnwick as both an obstacle and an opportunity. Each advance from the north carried with it the possibility of siege, and the castle's defenders learned quickly that vigilance was not an occasional duty, but a continuous state of existence. The earliest major challenges came in the form of swift raids, designed to probe weaknesses and measure the reactions of those inside the walls. Scouts would spot distant movement, smoke rising from the hillsides, or mounted riders emerging from the tree line, and alarms would ripple through the bailey. The heavy gates slammed shut, archers took their positions along the battlements, and the fortress shifted into its defensive rhythm. In these early encounters, the strategic value of Alnwick's transformation became unmistakable. The thickened stone walls absorbed the impact of battering attempts that would have shattered wooden defenses, while the new towers offered superior vantage points from which to track enemy formations and direct counterfire. What was once a vulnerable outpost became a knot of resistance that refused to loosen under pressure. As tensions escalated, the raids evolved into full attempts at siege. Among the most significant early confrontations was the assault launched by William the Lion, the Scottish king, whose ambitions reached deep into English territory. His forces arrived armed with the confidence of numerical strength, expecting the castle to falter under the weight of a coordinated attack. Instead, they found a structure engineered with an almost predictive understanding of siege warfare. Alnwick's defenders used every advantage the elevation and masonry provided. Arrow slits released steady volleys that kept attackers at a distance, while the rounded surfaces of the towers deflected projectiles instead of shattering under them. The bailey, once a simple enclosure, now functioned as an internal buffer, allowing troops to move between defensive zones quickly and without exposure. Inside the walls, the pressure of siege transformed everyday spaces into necessities of survival. Storerooms that normally held provisions became lifelines, supplying grain, salted meat, and barrels of ale that sustained the garrison through long standoffs. Workshops took on a feverish energy as craftsmen repaired weapons, reforged arrowheads, and bolstered shields splintered during skirmishes. Even the domestic chambers, which had begun to adopt hints of comfort, shifted into strategic roles. Rooms became quarters for soldiers, corridors became communication routes, and every inch of the castle served the singular purpose of endurance. Outside, the attackers found themselves battling not just stone, but strategy. The defenders knew when to conserve resources and when to unleash decisive countermeasures. They coordinated sally operations, targeted strikes outside the walls meant to disrupt siege equipment or scatter enemy preparations. These daring maneuvers capitalized on intimate knowledge of the terrain and often forced the besiegers to rethink their plans. For the Scots, Alnwick proved not to be an obstacle that could be worn down through persistence, but a fortress whose design actively thwarted their efforts. Time after time, the attackers withdrew, exhausted by resistance and forced to acknowledge that this castle, perched on its rise, was not easily claimed. Each assault left its marks. Stones blackened from fire attempts, arrowheads lodged in tower joints, and scars on battlements where impacts had been absorbed rather than allowed to destroy. Yet these marks only reinforced the perception of Alnwick as an indestructible presence. The castle seemed to gain authority from every clash, its reputation spreading far beyond the borderlands. Travelers spoke of its uncanny ability to stand firm, of its towers that seemed to bend with the force of battle, only to straighten again as soon as the threat passed. Over time, these stories cemented Alnwick's identity as more than a stronghold. It became a symbol of resilience carved into the northern landscape. Through these early wars, the castle proved that its shift from wood to stone had not merely changed its appearance, it had changed its destiny. The defenders learned to trust the walls as if they were comrades, while the attackers came to fear them as if they were alive. Each conflict refined the stronghold's purpose and exposed the strengths that would define it in the centuries to come. In enduring the assault of armies and ambitions, Alnwick stepped fully into its role as the shield of northern England, a fortress whose legend was forged not through tranquility, but through the fire of its first great tests. When Alnwick passed into the hands of the Percy family, the shift was more than a transaction. It was a turning point that redefined the castle's identity and set the trajectory for its next 7 centuries. The Percys were not passive inheritors. They were a rising force in northern England, a family whose ambitions matched the scale of the stronghold they now controlled. With their arrival, Alnwick transitioned from a hardened border fortress into a seat of influence, a place where power was not only defended but projected. The castle, once shaped primarily by the urgency of war, began to absorb the character of its new guardians, growing in confidence, complexity, and architectural grace. The first challenge facing the Percys was the same one that had haunted every previous owner. The border remained volatile. The Scots continued to test the northern defenses, and political tensions simmered across the region. For the new lords of Alnwick, strengthening the castle's fortifications was not optional. It was an immediate priority. They began by reinforcing the outer curtain walls, thickening the stonework and raising sections that had weathered under past sieges. Towers that once served as lookout posts were expanded into multi-level defensive platforms, capable of housing more soldiers and storing larger supplies of ammunition. These improvements transformed the castle from a sturdy refuge into a formidable military engine, capable of sustaining prolonged conflict while projecting a clear message to rivals. This stronghold would not fall easily. But the Percys did not stop at fortification. They understood that a castle of Alnwick's stature had to embody more than martial resilience. It needed to reflect the authority of the family whose banner flew above it. This meant reshaping the internal layout into something more fitting for a political and cultural center. The bailey began to evolve from a space dominated by utilitarian structures into a more organized compound, where administrative, residential, and military functions coexisted in deliberate harmony. New stone buildings appeared, halls designed for receiving envoys, chambers meant for council meetings, and expanded private quarters that signaled a shift toward comfort without compromising the castle's defensive posture. The towers themselves took on new significance during this early Percy era. Instead of merely housing guards or acting as elevated firing points, they became architectural statements. Some were heightened to enhance visibility over the surrounding lands, allowing the Percys to monitor movements of not only enemies but also allies, tenants, and travelers who passed through their domain. Others were reshaped internally to provide more spacious rooms, their interiors enhanced with improved hearths, broader staircases, and more refined masonry. The very forms of these towers, circular, polygonal, or D-shaped, mirrored the evolving balance between defense and daily life, between authority enforced and authority displayed. These changes also redefined the way outsiders experienced the castle. Approaching Alnwick during the Percy transformation would have felt dramatically different from the experience of earlier centuries. What had once been a severe border fortress now presented a bolder, more intentional facade. Strength was still the dominant impression, but it had been sharpened with symmetry, enhanced by height, and accented by architectural flourishes that hinted at the family's sophistication. Visitors entering through the gatehouse would move through spaces that spoke not only of war, but of order, of a family determined to weave governance, culture, and security into a single unified identity. Inside the walls, the heart of the castle beat with new energy. Great halls began to take shape, their lofty ceilings and expansive hearths preparing them for gatherings that were as political as they were ceremonial. These spaces offered a glimpse into the future character of Alnwick, a place where the echoes of armor and the murmur of diplomacy would coexist. The Percy family's presence turned the castle into a hub where alliances were negotiated, disputes settled, and strategies devised. The stronghold became as much a command center as it was a home, balancing the administrative demands of a powerful lineage with the practical needs of border defense. This early period of Percy stewardship laid the foundation for Alnwick's later splendor. Their initial reinforcements ensured that the castle could withstand the ever-changing political climate of medieval England, while their willingness to reshape and expand the interior signaled their long-term vision. Alnwick was no longer a reactionary structure built to answer threats. It was becoming an institution, an extension of a family whose influence stretched across the region. Through the Percys, the castle entered a new era, one where its walls held not only the weight of history, but the ambitions of a dynasty determined to leave a lasting mark on England's northern frontier. Under the stewardship of the Percys, Alnwick settled into a new rhythm, one that blended the rigor of military life with the deliberate choreography of political power. The castle no longer functioned merely as a defensive shell. It became a vibrant organism whose every room, passageway, and courtyard served a purpose in the complex machinery of governance. Within its walls, warriors sharpened their blades while envoys prepared their arguments, and the pulse of daily life beat with a mixture of discipline, ambition, and constant watchfulness. The Great Hall stood at the center of this world, a space where decisions that shaped the northern frontier often began. Its high-timbered ceiling amplified every conversation, from the low murmur of advisors discussing border disputes to the commanding tone of knights reporting on patrol routes. Long wooden tables stretched across the room, worn smooth by countless gatherings, meals, and hurried council meetings. When candles were lit in the iron chandeliers overhead, the hall took on a warm glow that softened the sternness of the stone walls, creating an atmosphere where political maneuvering mingled naturally with everyday living. Here, strategy sessions unfolded beside evening meals, allowing matters of state to flow seamlessly into the routines of the household. The adjacent chambers carried their own importance. Smaller meeting rooms offered privacy for delicate negotiations, where alliances were forged or tested. These spaces, furnished with sturdy wooden chairs and thick tapestries to insulate sound, functioned as diplomatic nerve centers. The Percys understood that influence was not built solely on battlefield victories, but also through conversations behind closed doors, and Alnwick provided the architecture to support both. Knights in armor and visiting nobles alike passed through these corridors, each with a role to play in maintaining the region's fragile equilibrium. Beyond the political heart of the castle stretched its practical infrastructure, a network of rooms and services that sustained daily life. The kitchens were among the busiest spaces, filled with ceaseless movement from before dawn until long after sunset. Fires roared in massive hearths built to roast entire sides of meat, and cauldrons simmered with stews meant to feed garrisons and visiting dignitaries alike. The scent of bread baking in the stone ovens drifted through the lower corridors, and the rhythmic chopping of vegetables punctuated the deep hum of activity. These kitchens were engines of survival and hospitality, capable of feeding hundreds during festivals or periods of heightened military presence. Nearby, the armory served as the castle's steel-lined spine. Racks of weapons lined the walls, bows meticulously restrung after patrols, polished helmets arranged in careful rows, shields repainted with family insignia. The clang of hammers on heated iron echoed through the space as blacksmiths worked tirelessly, repairing dents from training exercises or battles fought beyond the castle gates. This was not a quiet place, but one shaped by purposeful noise, the kind that spoke of preparation rather than chaos. Every sword sharpened and every suit of mail mended reinforced the castle's readiness, ensuring that its warriors never lacked the tools they needed. Sleeping quarters for knights and soldiers were arranged with efficiency in mind. The barracks housed rows of wooden cots, each with a soldier's belongings neatly stored beneath or beside it, boots, belts, tunics, and whatever personal tokens they carried to remind them of home. These rooms smelled of wool, metal oil, and wood smoke, the unmistakable signature of a life spent in service. Though simple, they were close to the strategic centers of the castle, allowing rapid mobilization whenever danger approached from the border. Above these more rugged living spaces, the private chambers of the Percy household revealed a different reality. Here, tapestries softened the cold stone, and windows were fitted with shutters designed to keep out the northern winds. These rooms balanced comfort with the quiet dignity expected of a noble residence. Members of the family moved between their quarters and the administrative heart of the castle, navigating a daily schedule filled with correspondence, audiences, estate management, and the constant oversight required to maintain stability over such a vast territory. Servants, too, played an essential role in the castle's intricate rhythm. They moved through hidden corridors and back staircases, ensuring meals arrived on time, fires stayed lit, guest rooms remained prepared, and messages circulated without delay. Their work made the castle hum smoothly, allowing the Percys and their retainers to focus on matters of defense and diplomacy. This backstage labor was as vital as any soldier's vigilance, sustaining the routines that kept Alnwick functioning as both a military hub and a seat of leadership. Together, these layers of activity created a world in which power was not simply declared, but enacted. Alnwick, under the control of warriors and politicians alike, became a microcosm of medieval authority, self-contained, organized, and always ready to confront whatever challenges approached its gates. Every sound, from clattering armor to whispered negotiations, contributed to a portrait of a castle that was as alive as the people who depended on it, a place where stone corridors carried the weight of decisions and where the presence of the Percy family resonated through each chamber and courtyard. The stability Alnwick had enjoyed under the powerful Percy lineage began to fracture when religious tensions swept across England, pulling noble families into conflicts larger than themselves. The castle, once alive with strategy and ceremony, entered a period where its fate hinged not on battles at the border, but on the shifting allegiances of faith and crown. When Thomas Percy, the 7th Earl of Northumberland, became entangled in the uprising known as the Rising of the North, a movement driven by loyalty to the old religious order, he set in motion events that would alter the trajectory of both his family and the fortress they had shaped for generations. Thomas's role in the rebellion placed him in direct opposition to the ruling powers, and the consequences reached far beyond personal punishment. When he was taken captive and ultimately executed for his part in the unrest, the loss reverberated throughout Alnwick. The Percys had long served as guardians of the North, but the fall of their leader instantly weakened their influence. Titles, privileges, and large tracts of land were seized or suspended, and with the family's political weight diminished, their ability to maintain their extensive holdings, including Alnwick, faltered. A castle that once pulsed with authority found itself abruptly deprived of the resources and leadership it required to function as the seat of a great dynasty. With the political blow came architectural consequences. The castle's halls, once bustling with knights, advisors, servants, and visitors, began to empty. The great hall, where lively debate and feasting had shaped daily life, grew quiet. Chairs sat unused, and long tables gathered layers of dust instead of hosting councils or celebrations. Chambers that once held the energy of governance became still, their hearths cold for the first time in decades. The steady flow of supplies that had kept the kitchens, workshops, and storerooms alive slowed to a trickle. Without a strong presence at the helm, the castle's intricate rhythm collapsed, leaving behind a shell of its former vitality. The physical structure itself soon showed signs of the family's decline. Stone walls that had once been meticulously repaired during each siege now suffered from neglect. Cracks in the masonry widened with each passing winter, and roof tiles loosened as harsh northern winds swept across the battlements. Sections of the outer defenses began to crumble, their once impenetrable surfaces reduced to vulnerable gaps. The towers, which had symbolized strength for generations, no longer received the constant upkeep required to keep them solid, and moisture seeped into the joints that had once been carefully sealed. The castle, built to endure battle, found itself unprepared for the quiet, persistent erosion of time. The absence of household staff accelerated the decline. Servants who had kept fires burning, kitchens stocked, and chambers orderly gradually dispersed, leaving behind rooms that fell into disuse. Dust settled on carved beams, and wind whistled through unbarred shutters. The armory, once alive with the clang of metalwork, became a silent place where weapons hung untouched, slowly tarnishing. Even the stables, which had once housed the horses that carried messages and knights across the borderlands, grew empty. Without routine care, the grounds became overgrown. Grass crept between the stones of the courtyards, and ivy climbed unchecked across the walls, finding purchase in spaces where mortar had weakened. The emotional weight of Thomas Percy's downfall lingered in the atmosphere of the castle long after the political shock faded. Alnwick had been built not only as a fortress, but as a home and a symbol of lineage, and the sudden void left by the family's retreat created a sense of abandonment that permeated every corner. Visitors who once felt awe at its grandeur now saw a place haunted by absence, grand but hollow. The stronghold that had weathered armies and sieges now struggled against a quieter but far more insidious enemy: neglect. As the decades passed, the decline deepened. Without the financial and political strength to restore or maintain it, Alnwick slipped further into disrepair. Where banners once flew proudly from the towers, empty poles rattled in the wind. Where feasts had been prepared to impress visiting nobles, kitchens lay dark, their fires long extinguished. The castle's defensive posture, once its defining characteristic, now appeared softened, blurred by the creeping advance of time and the scars left by political upheaval. Yet, even in its weakened state, the fortress retained a quiet dignity. Its silhouette remained unmistakable, and its foundations still carried the weight of centuries. Alnwick waited, silent, weathered, but not defeated, for the moment when another generation would recognize its potential and begin the slow, determined work of reviving what had nearly slipped into ruin. Without the guiding hand of the Percy family, and stripped of the political purpose that had once kept it alive, Alnwick slipped into a long twilight, an age not marked by fire or conquest, but by something more gradual and far more devastating: neglect. The fortress that had endured armies now faced an enemy it was never built to resist: time left unchecked. As the 17th century unfolded, the castle no longer resembled the vibrant hub of power it had once been. Instead, it became a vast, echoing monument to a fading era, its greatness eroding year by year in slow, almost imperceptible increments. The first signs of decay settled in quietly. Roofs that had once held firm against storms began to sag, and without constant repair, the tiles loosened and slipped, leaving gaps where rainwater seeped in. Leaks turned into trickles, trickles into steady drips, and entire sections of ceiling darkened with moisture until gravity won and beams gave way. Rooms that had once hosted noble gatherings stood open to the sky, their floors carpeted not with tapestries, but with the debris of fallen rafters and crumbled plaster. In winter, snow drifted through broken openings. In summer, shafts of sunlight illuminated dust motes swirling through abandoned chambers. The courtyards, once meticulously maintained by groundskeepers and patrolled by soldiers, transformed into wild gardens of their own. Grass grew long and tangled, creeping over stone pathways and swallowing the edges of stairways. Weeds pushed through cracks in the flagstones, and thorny shrubs rooted themselves in the corners where livestock had once been kept. Without human presence to trouble them, birds nested freely beneath collapsed eaves, and small animals scurried across spaces that had once echoed with the clang of armor and the murmur of political debate. Even the castle's sacred spaces were not immune to decline. The chapel, where families had been blessed and ceremonies held, fell into heartbreaking disrepair. Its stained glass windows shattered one by one in storms, leaving jagged shards that glittered dangerously in the empty frames. The wooden pews warped in the damp, and the stone altar cracked under the combined burden of water and frost. In place of candlelight and quiet prayer, ivy crawled across the walls, threading itself through crevices in the stone as though nature were reclaiming a place long denied to it. Birds perched atop what remained of the roof beams, their song echoing through a space that had once held solemn reverence. The fortress walls, though built to withstand siege engines, could not defend against centuries without care. Stones loosened, mortar crumbled, and in some places entire blocks shifted out of alignment. Trees took root in deep fissures, their roots winding through the ancient masonry like fingers gripping broken bones. When the wind blew, branches scraped against the towers, creating a sound that was at once eerie and strangely beautiful. Travelers who passed by reported that Alnwick no longer looked like a fortress. It looked like a memory, its silhouette unchanged, but its details softened, blurred by disrepair. Yet even in ruin, the castle possessed an undeniable allure. Artists, poets, and wanderers were drawn to its melancholy grandeur, captivated by the way sunlight filtered through roofless chambers, or how the once imposing towers stood draped in ivy like forgotten monuments wrapped in nature's shroud. The very features that marked its decline, collapsed roofs, gaping windows, overgrown courtyards, became the elements that gave it a haunting beauty. Alnwick turned into a romantic ruin, a place where history seemed to linger in the air, like a whispered story waiting to be rediscovered. Visitors who approached during this period often described the same sensation: a mix of sorrow and wonder. The castle's immense size made the neglect even more striking. Its vast scale emphasized how empty it had become. Walking through its silent corridors felt like intruding on the dreams of a giant who had fallen into a long sleep. Every fallen stone hinted at past glories, and every broken arch hinted at what had once stood proud. The place felt suspended between life and death, no longer thriving, not yet gone, but caught in a fragile, poignant state of waiting. This era of abandonment could have spelled the end for Alnwick. Many great strongholds of the north collapsed entirely during similar periods, their stones taken for nearby construction, or left to crumble into indistinguishable heaps. But Alnwick endured. Its bones were too strong, its foundations too deeply embedded in the earth, and its history too interwoven with the land to disappear quietly. Even as trees grew from its walls and rain carved channels into its floors, the core of the fortress held firm. Beneath the ruin, the castle waited for the moment when someone would see not decay, but potential, when a new generation would recognize that the giant, though wounded, still had the strength to rise again. The slow decay that had settled over Alnwick in the decades of neglect might have continued at its quiet, steady pace if England had not been swept into civil conflict. The turbulence of the 17th century brought with it a new kind of strain, one harsher and more sudden than the gentle erosion of time. The English Civil War pulled noble estates, fortified homes, and strategic strongholds into the machinery of political and military struggle, and Alnwick was no exception. For a castle already weakened by years of abandonment, the arrival of armies did not revive its martial spirit. It hastened its decline. When forces loyal to Oliver Cromwell moved through the north, they recognized Alnwick's strategic usefulness even in its deteriorated state. Its elevated position, thick outer walls, and proximity to key routes made it an ideal temporary garrison. Soldiers took control of the complex not as caretakers of heritage, but as occupiers in need of shelter, storage, and vantage points. The castle's ancient halls, once built for knights and noble guests, were commandeered as barracks, supply depots, and makeshift command centers. Rooms that had stood empty for years filled suddenly with troops, weapons, and the constant noise of military movement. Fires were lit in long unused hearths, and the hurried routines of a wartime garrison replaced the careful rhythms of a noble household. But the occupation was not gentle. Cromwell's forces had little interest in preserving the architectural legacy of the Percys. Their primary goal was efficiency in war, and everything else was secondary. Doors were removed from hinges to fuel fires in cold winters. Wooden paneling was torn down to patch damaged wagons or fortify temporary barricades. Storerooms were emptied of whatever remained useful. Stonework already weakened by age suffered under the weight of heavy equipment and constant trampling. Defensive towers, once shaped by precision, became vantage points for musketeers who cared little for the condition of the battlements beneath their boots. The pressures of military life left additional scars. Horses were stabled in areas never meant for animals, and their presence damaged floors and foundations. Open flames used for cooking and warmth scorched walls and filled rooms with smoke that settled into the stone. Barricades and temporary structures cluttered courtyards, altering the drainage patterns and worsening the castle's vulnerability to water damage. What little order had survived the era of neglect was undone by the necessities of war. When storms arrived, leaking roofs grew worse. When frost descended, cracks in the masonry deepened. Alnwick, already weakened, now buckled under the weight of misuse. Perhaps the most damaging consequence of the occupation was not the physical strain, but the loss of what remained of the castle's internal organization. Records disappeared, household systems collapsed entirely, and the few caretakers who might have preserved knowledge of maintenance routines were long gone. The army's presence erased continuity, leaving no one behind who understood how the structure had once been sustained. By the time the soldiers finally departed, they left a shell behind, one that bore the marks of hard living and utilitarian repurposing rather than the dignity of a historic stronghold. When calm finally returned and the castle stood empty again, its condition was far worse than the gentle ruin it had been before the conflict. Roofs that had sagged now gaped open. Towers that had cracked now crumbled at their edges. Water, the enemy of every old structure, infiltrated places once protected, accelerating the decay with each passing season. The chapel, already fragile, lost entire sections of its roof, and its interior became a patchwork of rubble and encroaching vegetation. Courtyards were choked with debris left behind by the garrison, and pathways became slick with moss. The once orderly layout of the bailey was unrecognizable, broken, cluttered, and partially swallowed by overgrowth. Inside, the atmosphere was one of deep abandonment. Rooms that had served as both political centers and military shelters now felt stripped of identity. Stone floors were littered with remnants of hastily abandoned equipment. Wall hangings and furniture, if any had survived previous decades, were now entirely gone. Without human presence or purpose, the silence of the castle felt heavier than before, as though the structure had absorbed the chaos of war and fallen into a deeper exhaustion. By the end of the century, Alnwick was not merely neglected, it was borderline uninhabitable. The damage wrought by war had compounded its pre-existing weaknesses, creating a structure that looked impressive from afar, but proved fragile upon closer inspection. The castle's once mighty form had survived sieges and border skirmishes, but the internal collapse caused by civil unrest and military occupation left it dangerously close to becoming a relic beyond repair. It would take extraordinary vision, enormous resources, and a renewed sense of purpose to reverse the devastation of this era, a task that awaited the next chapters of its long, troubled life. By the beginning of the 18th century, Alnwick stood as a haunting reminder of its former might, majestic in outline, but hollowed by time, conflict, and long stretches without a guiding hand. Where once the Percys had orchestrated political alliances and directed military campaigns, now only the wind moved freely through collapsed roofs and fractured corridors. Yet it was precisely in this state of ruin that the castle captured the imagination of a new generation of visionaries, architects and landscape designers who saw not a relic destined to fade, but a structure waiting for rebirth. The first to take up this challenge was James Payn, a rising architect whose work reflected the early stirrings of the neoclassical movement. When he arrived at Alnwick, he did not encounter a functioning residence but a monumental puzzle, a fortress with a proud skeleton but a weakened body. Payn approached the task not as a mere repairman, but as a strategist, mapping the surviving structures, identifying the areas that could still support reconstruction, and envisioning a layout that balanced practicality with grandeur. His initial efforts focused on making the castle habitable once again, stabilizing weakened walls, replacing collapsed roofs, and clearing the labyrinth of debris that filled many of the chambers. He repaired the great hall's structural bones, reopened blocked passageways, and restored enough of the internal framework to allow life to re-enter the long-abandoned stronghold. Payn's work was soon complemented by the contributions of Daniel Garrett, an architect known for his flair in blending elegance with durable design. Garrett brought a new level of refinement to Alnwick's interiors, introducing plasterwork that softened the fortress's harsher lines without erasing its medieval identity. His additions carried hints of the Rococo style, graceful curves, detailed ornamentation, and a sense of movement that contrasted with the solid, defensive nature of the surrounding stone. Under his direction, several of the castle's principal rooms began to regain their dignity. Ceilings were restored with delicate patterns, window frames were rebuilt to welcome light rather than shut it out, and corridors once filled with debris began to resemble living spaces once more. Yet the most dramatic transformation of this era unfolded not within the walls, but around them. Lancelot Capability. Brown, the legendary landscape architect whose vision redefined the English countryside, was invited to reimagine the land surrounding the castle. Brown saw potential not just in the fortress itself, but in the entire environment that framed it. To him, Alnwick was not an isolated monument, but a centerpiece, one that needed a setting worthy of its scale and history. He began reshaping vast sections of land, smoothing the rugged terrain into sweeping lawns and gentle slopes. Trees were planted in purposeful clusters to guide the eye toward the castle, creating vistas that made the stronghold appear both natural and dominant within its newly curated landscape. Brown also engineered water features that transformed the estate into a living picture. Serpentine lakes reflected the castle's silhouette, and raised causeways created carefully orchestrated approaches that heightened the visitor's sense of awe. Where the ruins had once retreated into wild overgrowth, the grounds now framed the castle like a masterpiece in a gallery, presenting Alnwick as a noble presence rather than a forgotten ruin. His designs merged nature with artistry, giving the fortress a sense of renewed importance long before its interiors had fully recovered. Together, Payne, Garrett, and Brown initiated the first true wave of salvation for Alnwick. Their efforts did not merely delay the castle's demise, they reversed its trajectory. Rooms that had been open to the sky now had roofs. Courtyards once choked with weeds were cleared and defined. Defensive walls regained structural integrity, and surrounding all of it, Brown's parkland offered a vision of harmony and grandeur that reintroduced Alnwick to the world, not as a decaying remnant, but as a revitalized estate with a future. The transformation was far from complete, but its direction was unmistakable. Visitors arriving during this period felt the unmistakable energy of revival. Scaffolding clung to walls like stitches closing old wounds. Craftsmen moved through the courtyards carrying stone, wood, and tools with purposeful determination. The silence of abandonment had been replaced by the steady sounds of rebuilding, hammers striking chisels, saws cutting through timber, and voices calling instructions across the grounds. Most importantly, the castle began to feel inhabited again, even if only by the presence of those who sought to restore it. The work of the 18th century architects laid the essential foundation for the waves of reconstruction that would follow in later centuries. Their vision rekindled the idea that Alnwick was not destined to fade into romantic ruin, but to rise once more as a powerful symbol of endurance, adaptation, and rebirth. When Robert Adam arrived at Alnwick in the latter half of the 18th century, the castle had already begun to stir from its long slumber. Payne had stabilized it, Garrett had refined it, and Brown had given it a breathtaking landscape in which to stand. But Adam did something bolder. He reimagined the castle's very identity. Where earlier architects had focused on saving and repairing, Adam focused on transforming. He envisioned a structure that would not merely function as a residence or a fortified relic, but as a statement of taste, culture, and modern aristocratic power. Under his hand, Alnwick moved beyond restoration and entered a renaissance of grandeur unlike anything it had known before. Adam approached the project with a clear mission: to fuse medieval strength with the fashionable elegance of the neoclassical revival sweeping across Britain. He did not want to erase the castle's martial past. Its towers, battlements, and defensive lines were too essential to its character. But he wanted the interiors to speak a different language, one that reflected refinement rather than survival. His designs ushered in an era where the fortress began to adopt the posture of a palace, blending its rugged exterior with interiors worthy of Europe's most sophisticated courts. One of Adam's most significant contributions was the reconstruction and reimagining of the principal rooms. Spaces that had once echoed with the noise of armor or lay abandoned in damp ruin were transformed into showcases of artistry. He introduced intricate plaster ceilings that rippled with geometric precision and mythological motifs. Walls that had once been bare stone now glowed with delicate ornamentation, creating visual harmony and warmth. He installed sweeping fireplaces with carved mantels, turning cold chambers into inviting salons where conversation could unfold beneath elegant archways. The transformation was profound. Rooms that once served defensive or purely functional roles evolved into luxurious environments meant for entertaining, hosting, and projecting the cultured authority of the Percy family. Adam's work on the facades subtly altered the castle's external presence as well. Without compromising the massive defensive silhouette, he refined certain exterior sections to align with the developing neo-Gothic aesthetic. Windows were reshaped, entrances were accentuated, and architectural details softened the fortress's once harsh edges. What had been a fortress first and a residence second now took on the dual identity of both, a home of prestige wrapped in the shell of a medieval titan. Visitors arriving at Alnwick during this period encountered a castle that felt at once ancient and strikingly modern, its centuries-old walls embracing a new life filled with elegance and intention. The centerpiece of Adam's reinvention was the creation of elite ceremonial spaces. The state rooms, which had been dark, damaged, or disorganized after decades of neglect, became the heart of the castle's new identity. Adam crafted grand drawing rooms adorned with gilded details, their ceilings rising in elaborate displays of craftsmanship that drew the eyes upward and made the spaces feel larger than their physical dimensions. These rooms flowed naturally into adjoining chambers, forming a sequence of spaces designed to impress guests not with sheer size, but with sophistication and coherence. Every element, from the placement of columns to the curvature of doorways, was orchestrated to guide movement, reflection, and admiration. The castle's transformation extended beyond individual rooms. Adam's vision introduced a new sense of unity to the structure, tying together old and new elements into a cohesive experience. For the first time in centuries, Alnwick looked less like a collection of additions built for survival, and more like a planned residence shaped by artistic ambition. His influence gave the castle a refined personality, elevating it from restored ruin to a symbol of aristocratic renewal. Under his hand, the fortress shed the last shadows of abandonment and embraced a glittering new role as a cultural beacon. This period marked a dramatic shift in how the castle functioned within the social world of northern England. Where Alnwick had once been a bulwark against danger, it now became a stage on which the Percys could display their legacy and taste. Balls, gatherings, diplomatic meetings, and artistic patronage shaped its new daily rhythm. The castle's interiors, now glowing with color, texture, and architectural confidence, spoke of a family reasserting its place in society after generations of turmoil. Robert Adams' contributions became the aesthetic backbone upon which later renovations would build. But even on their own, they marked one of the most significant chapters in the castle's evolution. Alnwick was no longer simply surviving, it was shining. Once again, it became impossible to ignore, an architectural statement rising from the northern landscape, blending its medieval roots with the opulence of the modern age. The castle, born from conflict, rebuilt through necessity, now stood as a symbol of revived luxury, artistic ambition, and the enduring resilience of a great lineage. When the 19th century arrived, Alnwick stood at a crossroads. The earlier restorations had stabilized it and filled many of its rooms with elegance. Yet the castle still carried remnants of its fragmented past, uneven layouts, mismatched structures from different eras, and sections that bore the scars of centuries of war and abandonment. It needed more than refinement. It needed a unifying vision bold enough to transform a restored fortress into a masterpiece that honored its medieval roots while embracing the expectations of a modern aristocratic household. That vision came with Algernon Percy, the fourth Duke of Northumberland, a man whose ambitions were as vast as the stone walls he inherited. Algernon viewed Alnwick not merely as a residence, but as a cultural and architectural inheritance worthy of full rebirth. He saw what many before him had missed, that the castle possessed the bones of greatness, but required a guiding mind to bring coherence to its sprawling form. And so, he sought out Anthony Salvin, one of the era's most skilled architects, known for his mastery in revitalizing medieval structures without robbing them of their soul. Together, the Duke and Salvin embarked on a reconstruction campaign that would redefine Alnwick for the modern age. Salvin approached the castle with a combination of reverence and determination. His first goal was to correct the structural inconsistencies left behind by centuries of patchwork building. Rooms had been expanded, altered, abandoned, or repurposed so many times that the internal flow of the castle resembled a maze rather than a coherent home. Salvin began by reorganizing these spaces, rerouting corridors, improving access between wings, and introducing a more intuitive spatial logic. What had once been a labyrinth shaped by necessity gradually became a grand residence engineered for comfort and ceremony. With structural clarity came expansion. Salvin added new towers that blended so seamlessly with the medieval aesthetic that visitors often struggled to distinguish which were ancient and which were Victorian. These towers maintained the defensive silhouette of the castle, but brought modern stability, improved living quarters, and architectural balance to the sprawling complex. The proto-tower, one of Salvin's most striking contributions, rose as a fusion of medieval inspiration and contemporary craftsmanship. Its vaulted rooms, broad windows, and refined stonework reflected Algernon's desire for a residence that was at once historic and fully modern. Salvin paid special attention to the castle's exterior, elevating the entrance into a grand statement of arrival. He redesigned the main gateway, adding a new portcullis structure that restored the medieval grandeur lost during earlier centuries of damage. This impressive entrance set the tone for what visitors would experience inside, a fortress that preserved its roots while embracing the elegance expected of a 19th century ducal residence. Inside, the transformation was no less dramatic. Salvin redesigned entire suites of rooms, clearing out remnants of older, cruder layouts, and replacing them with richly appointed halls, galleries, and living spaces. He introduced larger windows, allowing natural light to fill interior chambers that had once been dim. Fireplaces underwent redesign, gaining carved detailing and improved heating efficiency. High ceilings were accentuated with intricate plasterwork and timber beams, blending medieval atmosphere with Victorian craftsmanship. Staircases were widened or rebuilt to improve movement throughout the castle, making navigation both practical and strikingly beautiful. Under Algernon's direction, these renovations were not purely functional, they were deeply personal. The Duke was a passionate collector and patron of the arts, and he envisioned Alnwick as a showcase for his interests. Salvin designed rooms that could house extensive art collections, scientific instruments, and historical artifacts. The castle evolved into something more than a home. It became an estate that celebrated knowledge, culture, and the Percy legacy in equal measure. Every space served both a domestic purpose and a symbolic one, reinforcing the castle's identity as a living monument. The landscape surrounding the castle, shaped earlier by Capability Brown, was refined further to harmonize with Salvin's architectural additions. Sightlines were recalibrated so that the new towers framed the countryside in striking panoramas. Gardens were reorganized to complement the castle's renewed grandeur, offering visitors a seamless transition between sculpted grounds and historic stone. By the time Salvin's work drew to a close, Alnwick had been transformed once again, this time not as a response to crisis, but as a deliberate step into the future. The castle retained its medieval soul, yet it now possessed the sophistication required of a 19th century noble residence. It emerged from the reconstruction as both a fortress and a palace, its jagged battlements standing proudly beside refined interiors, its ancient history intertwined with modern ingenuity. The fourth Duke's vision and Salvin's skill lifted Alnwick to a new pinnacle. No longer a collection of repaired sections, it became a cohesive whole, a castle reborn in stone, light, and intention. The stronghold that had once teetered on the brink of ruin now projected stability, elegance, and cultural prominence. Alnwick had evolved once more, proving that even after centuries of turmoil and transformation, it still possessed the strength to adapt and the grandeur to inspire. As the 19th century waned and the newly revitalized Alnwick stood whole once more, the castle entered a remarkable phase in which its role shifted from fortress and residence to something far more expressive, a living museum shaped from within. The work of restoration had provided stability and coherence, but what came next transformed the castle into a curated world, where every room, object, and architectural detail contributed to a narrative of heritage, artistry, and collected memory. The Percys, now firmly re-established as cultural patrons, turned their attention to the interiors, viewing the castle not merely as a home, but as a grand vessel for art, knowledge, and the opulence of the ages. The heart of this transformation was the rebirth of the library. Once a shadowed space that had survived fire, war, and long abandonment, it was reimagined as an intellectual sanctuary worthy of a great estate. Shelves carved from rich woods rose toward arched ceilings, each housing volumes that mapped centuries of thought, books on astronomy, natural science, history, poetry, and ancient civilizations. Light filtered through tall windows, illuminating gilded lettering on leather bindings and casting quiet reflections across the polished floor. This room was more than a collection. It was a declaration of identity, representing a lineage that valued learning as much as legacy. Visitors stepping into the library felt the presence of curiosity preserved through time, a gentle contrast to the martial echoes embedded in the castle's earlier centuries. From the library, the experience of Alnwick unfolded like a ceremonial procession. The staterooms, once cold, damaged spaces, had been reborn as visual spectacles, each reflecting the heightened aesthetic sensibilities of the period. Ceilings became works of art, adorned with gilded patterns that caught candlelight and cast warm, shimmering glows across the rooms below. The gold was not simply decorative, it was symbolic, reinforcing the castle's renewed status and the family's confidence in their restored position. The ceilings, gilded and intricately carved, guided the eye upward and created an atmosphere where even silence felt grand. Italian influences infused many of these spaces, particularly in the drawing rooms and galleries. Inspired by Renaissance palaces and classical motifs, the architects and decorators incorporated elegant moldings, fresco-like embellishments, and balanced symmetry into the interiors. Walls were dressed in silk damasks and embroidered fabrics, creating surfaces that seemed to breathe with color and texture. Marble fireplaces framed with intricate carvings became focal points, each one uniquely designed to elevate the room around it. These Italianate elements softened the medieval bones of the structure, blending warmth and refinement with the fortress's more severe history. One of the most striking additions to the castle's cultural identity was the creation of dedicated galleries. These spaces housed collections that reflected the wide-ranging interests of the Percy family. Porcelain displays showcased delicate works from Chelsea, Meissen, and Paris. Gleaming ceramics arranged in cabinets like jewels. Their colors ranged from soft pastels to deep cobalt blues, and their surfaces depicted pastoral scenes, mythological figures, or intricate botanical patterns. Arranged with precision, the porcelain collections created a quiet rhythm of curves and reflections, offering visitors a serene counterpoint to the imposing stone around them. In contrast, the armories presented the castle's fiercer legacy. Against walls lined with dark wood, weapons from various centuries, swords, halberds, shields, pistols, and armor, were displayed with almost theatrical intention. These collections did not evoke violence, but craftsmanship. The fine engraving on a blade, the balance of a ceremonial sword, the careful molding of a breastplate meant for a nobleman. The armories functioned as a bridge between the castle's war-torn past and its cultivated present, reminding visitors that the luxury now on display had been earned through ages of defense and sacrifice. Every room added during this era contributed to Alnwick's evolving identity as a curated environment. The transformation was not simply aesthetic, it represented a shift in purpose. The castle was no longer defined by the battles it had endured or the political storms it had weathered. Instead, it embodied the accumulated spirit of centuries, its medieval roots, its periods of decline, its rebirths through architecture, and now its blossoming into a sanctuary of culture and refinement. The Percy family did not merely decorate their home, they shaped a narrative in which Alnwick became an extension of their intellectual and artistic ambitions. Visitors walking through the castle during this period experienced something unique, a structure that showed its history openly while offering the sensory richness of a gallery and the intimacy of a home. Every corridor carried the echo of footsteps belonging to people from different eras. Every object held a story. Every ornamented ceiling seemed to celebrate the triumph of preservation over neglect. Alnwick had become, unmistakably, a living museum, a place where history did not sit frozen behind glass, but breathed within the architecture itself. The 21st century brought with it yet another reinvention of Alnwick, this time not through battlements or gilded ceilings, but through the landscapes that surround the castle like an extension of its personality. Where Capability Brown had once smoothed the wilderness into sweeping parkland, a new vision emerged that embraced both drama and experimentation. The modern gardens, created under the guidance of the Duchess of Northumberland, transformed the estate into a living canvas where history, art, and ecological curiosity merge into something both beautiful and slightly mischievous. These gardens do not merely frame the castle, they converse with it, amplifying its long narrative in ways that feel fresh yet deeply rooted in the estate's tradition of reinvention. One of the most striking additions is the Poison Garden, a place whose quiet danger mirrors the intrigue that once defined life within the castle walls. Enclosed by dark gates and guarded by stern warnings, the garden feels like a chapter rescued from a medieval manuscript, mysterious, unsettling, and irresistible. Inside, more than 100 toxic and narcotic plants thrive under careful supervision, each one carrying its own story of folklore, medicine, or misused power. Ivy tunnels and flame-shaped beds guide visitors along paths lined with species that have shaped wars, myths, and tragedies across centuries. The space is educational, but also atmospheric, reminding guests that even the most beautiful things can carry shadows. In its own theatrical way, the Poison Garden channels the castle's long history of conflict and secrecy, turning botanical knowledge into a storytelling tool. Beyond the Garden of Dangers lies the cascading display of water that defines the Grand Cascade, a centerpiece built with the scale and rhythm of a stage performance. Water flows down layered terraces in choreographed sequences, rising and falling in patterns that echo the pulse of a living monument. The design feels almost architectural in its precision, mirroring the geometric solidity of the castle's towers while bringing motion into a place built on stone. Visitors walking alongside the rushing waters experience a sense of immersion that unites nature with design, as if the landscape itself has learned to speak in harmony with the castle. Other sections of the gardens offer softer experiences. The Rose Garden boasts thousands of English roses whose shapes and fragrances create a calm that contrasts with the fortress's immense stone presence. Their blooms spread in waves of color, and the walkways curve gently, allowing guests to feel as though they are drifting through fragrance rather than simply walking through a planting scheme. The Serpent Garden adds playfulness, an interactive series of water sculptures and mirrored surfaces that delight families while subtly introducing scientific ideas about motion and reflection. Bronze sculptures by notable artists punctuate the grounds, turning pathways into quiet galleries where art encounters nature at its own pace. Together, these gardens redefine how visitors experience Alnwick. Instead of serving as mere ornamentation, they extend the narrative of the castle outward, blurring the boundary between architecture and landscape. The gardens feel like modern chapters added to a very old book, a continuation rather than a departure. They speak to creativity, resilience, and the willingness to reinterpret tradition, traits that have sustained the castle through every era it has survived. As guests wander through the modern grounds, they participate in a story that feels both ancient and new, sensing the castle's heartbeat not only in its walls, but in every leaf, petal, and flowing stream. In this contemporary era, Alnwick stands at yet another pinnacle of transformation, balancing its identity as a private residence, a cultural attraction, and a beacon of historic preservation. Its ancient stones now coexist with the demands of modern tourism, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors each year who come to walk its corridors, explore its gardens, and experience a living piece of England's past. The castle's mixture of grandeur and authenticity has also captured the attention of filmmakers, turning Alnwick into a recognizable backdrop for cinematic worlds. It served as the training grounds for young wizards in the early Harry Potter films, as the stately Brancaster Castle in Downton Abbey, and as an atmospheric setting in various historical and fantasy productions. These appearances have introduced the stronghold to audiences far beyond the borders of Northumberland, embedding it in global popular culture. At the same time, ongoing restoration ensures that the castle's historical integrity remains intact. Craftsmen continue to repair stonework, maintain ancient timbers, and preserve rooms that carry the artistic imprint of past architects. The Percy family works with historians, conservators, and local communities to keep the estate vibrant while protecting its authenticity. Even small adjustments, like lightning conductors hidden within the architecture or improved pathways designed to accommodate modern foot traffic, are implemented with a respect for the castle's character. Each restoration choice balances innovation with memory, ensuring the structure remains both functional and faithful to its past. The future of Alnwick is shaped by this dual commitment to preservation and evolution. Plans to rejuvenate nearby historical buildings, such as the old station that now houses the beloved Barter books, hint at a broader vision of revitalizing the region's cultural heritage. Sustainability projects, including modern lighting for the Percy tenantry column and careful energy-efficient upgrades across the estate, demonstrate a forward-looking approach that aligns history with responsibility to the environment. The castle no longer serves as a battlefield or a political seat, but as a guardian of memory, an anchor that links past generations to those of today and tomorrow. Alnwick's survival, when so many other castles collapsed into ruin or faded into irrelevance, can be traced to a single defining quality: its ability to change without losing itself. Every era brought new challenges, yet the stronghold endured by adapting, transitioning from wooden motte and bailey to stone bastion, from abandoned ruin to neo-Gothic marvel, from private residence to cultural landmark. Its walls have absorbed conflict, neglect, reinvention, and creativity, shaping a legacy that continues to unfold. The castle thrives today not because it resisted change, but because it embraced it with intention and imagination. As visitors step onto the grounds in the present day, passing through modern gardens, walking beneath medieval towers, or standing in rooms gilded by centuries of artistry, they encounter a place that embodies continuity and motion. Alnwick has lived many lives, and in each one, it has found a way to resonate with the world around it. The legend endures because the castle does more than preserve history. It inspires, adapts, and invites each new generation to discover its story for themselves.